The Quran is full of stories that are an embarrassment to certain Muslims, especially Muslim apologists who have the undesirable task of trying to defend its divine inspiration. The embarrassment here arises both because of where these stories came from and also because of what they say. In the first part of this series, I discussed one of these stories, namely the Jewish fable about a group of Jews who were transformed by Allah into apes and swine because they violated the Sabbath day. Jews had made up this story in order to dissuade people from violating the Sabbath. Apparently, telling them they'd be turned into apes and swine was enough to do the job. Well, because Muhammad didn't know the difference between stories that came from the Bible and stories that were made up later, he ignorantly incorporated this story into the Quran as if it were a revelation from God. Understandably uncomfortable with this story being included in the Quran, Shabir Ali says that it should be taken figuratively rather than be accepted at face value. In fact, Shabir even says that if this story and others like it is understood literally, then the Quran would be guilty of teaching ridiculous nonsense.
It seems to me better to take the less miraculous sort of description or explanation of a thing. Okay. And that is normal. We use all kinds of expressions which, if one were to take them in a very literal sense, would be ridiculous. But when we use these expressions, we expect that the listener will take it in a reasonable sense.
Were it not for the fact that Islam is so inimical to humor, it would be tempting to think that Shabir was here engaging in satire. After all, his show is called
Let the Quran Speak,
which is just to say, let the Quran mean what it says, and not what others want to reinterpret it to mean, so that it doesn't end up looking like ridiculous nonsense. Now, to Shabir's credit, he admits that the vast majority of commentators in the history of Islam have understood this verse to clearly teach that Allah literally transformed people into apes and swine.
Most of the commentators have taken it in a very literal way.
This in itself is a devastating admission. After all, part of the boast found over and over again in the Quran is that the Quran is a clear book. In fact, so clear that it explains everything in exhaustive detail. Verily, those who conceal the clear proofs, evidences, and the guidance which we have sent down, after we have made it clear for the people in the book, they are the ones cursed by Allah and cursed by the cursors. Aleph Lam Ra. This is a book with verses basic or fundamental of established meaning, further explained in detail from one who is wise and well acquainted with all things. What this means is, if the vast majority of Muslim interpreters are wrong and Shabir is right, then the Quran is in error when it claims to be a clear book and exhaustively detailed. On the other hand, if the majority of Muslim interpreters are right and Shabir is wrong, then the Quran contains ridiculous stories. Personally, I'm fine with either option. Well, having already admitted that most Muslims have taken these passages literally, Shabir attempts to gain some credibility or traction for his view by mentioning two lone exceptions, namely Mujahid, a relatively early commentator on the Quran, and Yusuf Ali, a relatively modern commentator on the Quran.
Mujahid, who was one of the early commentators on the Quran, a student of Ibn Abbas, who said that the proper understanding of this is not that people were literally changed into animals, but that they took on some characteristics that one might describe as animalistic. I guess what he had in mind is almost similar to what we have when we say, this guy is a pig. So we don't mean literally he is a pig. We mean that he behaves in a manner that is not refined. And we say that the person eats like a pig or something like this. Yusuf Ali, in his translation of the Quran and in his comments, notes dealing with that, tends to take a more rational stance towards it.
While Mujahid does put forth a view that roughly approximates what Shabir believes, he offers no argument for it, nothing that can be evaluated. And so Mujahid's opinion ends up being nothing more than that, just baseless conjecture. To quote Mujahid, "Their hearts were transformed. That is, they were not transformed into apes. This is but a metaphor coined by God with regard to them, similar to the metaphor of the ass carrying books. Not only does Mujahid not offer any argument for this view, but the comparison he makes to Surah 62:5, which shows that elsewhere Allah uses figures of speech, only makes matters worse. According to the verse, the likeness of those who were entrusted with the obligation of the Torah, that is, to obey its commandments and practice its laws, but who subsequently failed in those obligations, is as the likeness of a donkey which carries huge burdens of books, but understands nothing from them. Notice that this verse twice uses the word likeness. That is, it makes it clear that what we have in this passage is a simile or figure of speech. But that's exactly what we don't find in those passages that speak of Allah turning Sabbath breakers into apes and swine. If Allah wanted to make it clear that he was speaking figuratively in those passages, when he said that he transformed and cursed Jews so they would be apes and swine, then he could have given us the kind of detail that would have made that obvious, like he did in Surah 62:5. Once again, we must conclude that either the Quran is not a clear and sufficiently detailed book like it claims, or, according to the Quran, Allah really did turn certain Jews into apes and swine, which is ridiculous. So much for Shabir's appeal to Mujahid. His appeal to Yusuf Ali isn't any better. First of all, Yusuf Ali did not say or in any way indicate that he inclined toward the figurative interpretation. In 3 out of 4 of his comments on this story in the Quran, in Surah 2, Surah 7, and Surah 4, he simply lets these statements of the Quran stand. He simply puts them forth as if he accepts them at face value. In other words, he gives no indication of accepting an allegorical interpretation as the most likely interpretation of the verse. The only time that Yusuf Ali ever does mention this view is in his comment on Surah 560, where he only mentions it as a bare possibility. To quote Yusuf Ali, "Perhaps both apes and swine are allegorical." Second, when Yusuf Ali refers to this view as a possibility, just like Mujahid, he doesn't offer any arguments for it. Perhaps that's because there are no arguments for it, at least none worth mentioning. Third, when Yusuf Ali explains what this passage would mean if taken allegorically, the explanation which he gives, which is the same as that of Mujahid and Shabir Ali, ends up being circular nonsense. Perhaps both apes and swine are allegorical. Those who falsified Allah's scriptures became lawless like apes, and those who succumbed to filth, gluttony, or gross living became like swine. This interpretation is circular nonsense, since it ends up saying that those lawless individuals who broke the Sabbath were cursed to behave lawlessly, and those Jews who engaged in filthy living on the Sabbath were cursed to engage in filthy living. What a waste of a perfectly good curse. Obviously, since they were already lawless according to the Quran, then the curse of Allah has to refer to something else. In other words, it's not figurative. And you know what that means.
If one were to take them in a very literal sense, would be ridiculous.